This video is going to take you through the AO2 source question. This is the question where there will be two sources and you have to make use of them together. So here we've got our two sources, and if you imagine you are going into the exam, you need to take some highlighters with you. First thing you need to do when you sit down and you read the question is take note of two things. One, they will always say that you have to make use of sources 3 and 4 together. But the other thing, the thing you really need to highlight is what the focus of the question is. There's always a danger with these source questions that you tend to go down a more generalized analysis of the sources and what they are suggesting. But you have to target it to the precise wording of the question. So highlight the precise wording, which in this case is the situation surrounding the change of presidency in 1974. So they're clearly alluding to the Watergate scandal. So highlight the focus of the question, then read the two sources through a couple of times. You'll be in a bit of a panic, because it's the start of the exam, but you need to read them through carefully a few times. Then get your highlighter out and start highlighting the phrases that are relevant to the question about the situation surrounding the change of presidency in 1974. Highlight them and maybe jot a few notes down in the margin around the source about what it is suggesting about the situation. If we look at the bottom here, this is what we're going to suggest as your structure. Because there's quite a lot of time pressure for this question, there's no point doing an introduction. It's not going to add any value to your answer. So first paragraph is going to be focused on the value of the content of both sources. So what does the writing in the boxes suggest about the situation surrounding the change of the presidency? We need to remember this first paragraph is probably going to be the longest of your three main paragraphs. The second paragraph, we're going to look at when they were written. In this case, it's 1974, and consider what was going on in America in 1974 and how that might affect the value of the sources to the historian. And the third paragraph is going to be on the value of the provenance. That's looking at who has written it, or written both of the sources, why they might have written them, and the nature of the sources. So in this case, it's that one is from a book by the press secretary and the other one is a nationwide address. So these different natures, how would they affect the way that they are presenting the information, and how does that affect the value to the historian? So what I'm going to suggest you do is you stop the video here and jot down some ideas about what these two sources suggest about the situation surrounding the change of presidency, and on the next few pages we're going to go through a model answer. So this is my content paragraph. Remember, I'm not going to have an introduction. There's a few things we're going to read through this and going to note a few things. First of all, really importantly, I have started this with both sources. So I'm showing the examiner that I'm using the content of the sources in combination. So they're both useful for understanding how dramatic the change of presidency was in 1974. Ford uses the language of extraordinary circumstances. Now note, I'm doing really short quotations. There's no value in just writing out long sentences. So really short sentences or just a phrase. So Ford uses the language of extraordinary circumstances, and in source 4 it refers to the political storm, another really short phrase. This suggests, now this is quite a key thing, I'm now making an inference, this suggests it was a momentous event in American history. So there's my inference, and now I'm going to develop that with my own knowledge. So Nixon had resigned rather than face the inevitable impeachment for his role in the Watergate scandal. Nixon had attempted to cover up a break-in at the Watergate building, and by 1973 the House had begun impeachment proceedings. This in itself was unprecedented. Ford himself was in an unprecedented situation. He'd not been elected, as the previous Vice President, Spiro Agnew, had been forced to resign due to tax evasion. Furthermore, and I'm going on to a second inference here, both sources highlight the desire to rebuild the required trust in government. That Ford is stating he needs to make an unprecedented commitment suggests Here's my second inference. The level of damage done to trust in the office of the presidency. And now I'm going to develop that with some of my own knowledge. In the 1976 election, only 54% of Americans turned out to vote, which suggests that Ford failed in his mission. This is reinforced in source 4 because Ford reopened the Watergate wound by pardoning Nixon. Ford's approval rating dropped from 50% to 70% as a result of the pardon. Third inference coming up, both sources also suggest that it was difficult for presidents after Nixon to move on from Watergate. Ford claims the nightmare of Watergate is over and implores the American people to move on. Yet Ford undermined those efforts, and this is expressed in source 4 as public opinion was 8-1 against the pardon. And then I'm kind of developing, and finally with a bit of my own knowledge, the media have been central to the uncovering of the Watergate scandal, and this continued, labelling Ford Bozo the Clown. So I'm just going to put on the right hand side the key points for this content paragraph, which remember is going to be your longest paragraph. So I've started with both sources from the opening to show I'm using them in combination. I've used really short quotations. I've used the word suggests to indicate to the examiner I am making an inference. I've used lots of precise supporting evidence to develop those inferences. Right, next is my context paragraph. This is where I look at the date when it was written and how that affects the value of the source. So I'm going to start with that it's useful because they originate from the centre of the fallout of Watergate in 1974. That's the year Nixon resigned. However, now this is a full evaluation because I'm now going to say there's a limitation to this. The emphasis they place on Watergate and the decline in trust of the government presidency had actually begun way before that with the release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, and possibly even before that because the idea of an imperial presidency had started under the Johnson administration and the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The sources can express the short-term impact of the Watergate affair, but the impact was still witnessed in the 1976 election, the rejection of Ford as president, and the election of Carter, an inexperienced politician, and the move to the right by the Republican Party in the 1980 election. So, key points to bring out from this context paragraph. I'm going to keep coming back to this idea of usefulness because it's in the question to indicate their value to the historian. I've said that it's a strength, but I've also evaluated the limitations because they're both from 1974, and I've also used knowledge to place the sources in context. Right, so next paragraph is going to be my provenance paragraph. So this is where I'm looking at the nature, origin, purpose of the sources. So I've said that the provenance is very useful. So I've made a judgment here. They both have an insider perspective of the Watergate affair and the aftermath. De Horst is additionally useful because he resigned after 30 days. So how does that, if we think about how that affects the way he's going to write, he has the freedom to express his true feelings on the pardon of Nixon. Ford's speech, the nature is very different. It's intended to appeal to the American people to draw a line under Watergate, and therefore he's perhaps failing to accurately express the extent of blame for Nixon for events surrounding the change of presidency. Instead, he's calling on prayers for Nixon. So, key things. Nature is its speech, newspaper, academic source. How does that affect the value of the sources? If we're going to use them in combination, it's good to have a variety of sources. So is there a balance between the two? Think about the origin, where they come from. Are they well placed to provide an insight into the topic? Thinking about the purpose. Is there an obvious reason why this source has been produced? In the case of Ford, absolutely, because it's a nationwide address. Note, this is not asking about reliability or bias. I've not used those words at all, and the focus is on the value of the sources to a historian. So my final paragraph, or my final part of this essay, is going to be my conclusion. So the value of the sources is in the content as they express the key issues surrounding the change of presidency. So I'm going to find some strengths of the sources together, and in this case I think it's the content, because they highlight the lack of authority, the lack of trust, and the impact of the pardon. The status of the authors also adds value because of their close proximity to the events. However, I'm going to balance that and say, well, there is a limitation because they're both written in 1974 and they can't place this change of presidency in the wider context. And certainly the longer term causes and the longer term impact, and that's a limitation to their value to a historian. So here are my kind of concluding statements for the conclusion. They need to evaluate the strengths and the strengths of the sources together, and then also balance that up. Where are the weaknesses? Is it in the provenance? Is it in the context? Or is it in the content?